Hi. Hi. Before I introduce our amazing guest speakers and moderator, I want to quickly introduce myself. Hi, I'm Nilay Ursoy. I'm a junior at the college studying government and sociology with a specialization in data science. And yeah, I'm happy to start with our gifted child who started college at the age of 13 and graduated at 17 with a degree in math, and further on went to support Obama's 2012 campaign and created the so-called, with his team of course, the Golden Report. Now he is the head of data science at Blue Rose Research. David Shor. Next, I want to introduce Matt Oczkowski. He was the head of product at Cambridge Analytica, who, while he was also one of the main data scientists for Donald Trump's 2016 campaign, he saw something creeping in that not a lot of pollsters saw, and now he is the founder and CEO of Human Behavior. Coming up to a Harvard alum who's still very much engaged at the government department, as I believe a lot of us would like to be, Dritan Nesho. He was working for Microsoft as a director of tech and civic engagement. Also, he was involved with forming Microsoft's cybersecurity and democracy division. Now he's the founder and CEO of HarrisX. And last but not least, our amazing moderator, Professor Stephen Ansolabehere. I hope I pronounced this correctly. He's an expert on public opinion and elections at the government department. He's also the author of 5 books, and I feel like he's not the only one in his family who has good writing skills, as his brother actually is a screenwriter of one of my favorite childhood TV shows. But getting back to how amazing our professor is, he won the Goldsmith Book Prize for the book Going Negative. We all should read that. So, yeah.
Thank you. This is a panel on post-mortems and future mortems, or pre-mortems. And so I'm going to take the framing of this seriously, and I'm going to ask you one question, and we'll elaborate on that question. The question is, it's the middle of November 2028. What is your post-mortem on the 2028 election? We'll start with Dritan, because he got this question out of me in the hallway, and so he's had more time to think about it than David and Matt have. So it's like, what's your take, Dritan? It's 2028, it's November, you're sober now, you're done with the hangover from the election. What do you got?
I'm afraid I'm going to answer the question with a non-answer, but here's an interesting trend that we are noticing in some research that we are doing around the upcoming impact and role of AI in elections. For the last 2 years, beginning with a study that we presented at APOR and another study that we presented at GlobeSec, followed up on international, we've been testing people's ability to discern between AI-generated content, different types of content, and real-world content. I'm happy to share the study with anyone who's interested, and we'll be making it public for all to look at shortly. But at best, you lose about 1/3 of the electorate to misinformation or disinformation. They just can't tell the difference. And then once they understand that it was AI that duped them, they lose complete trust in any type of content that they see. At worst is over 60%. And that's very problematic because, as we saw even in the last election, the dynamic, it was a competitive election all the way to the end. The dynamic flipped in the last couple of weeks. And in our polling, and we run an overnight poll at HarrisX every single night, and during elections, it's probably a couple or a few overnight polls that are running concurrently to make sure that we capture as broad of a swath of respondents as we can. about 7 to 10% of the electorate was still undecided in the last 2 weeks. And they decided late, they decided based on issues, and frankly, they broke for Donald Trump in a fairly significant way. In our polling, it was double digits, but even in the exit polling, it was high single digits delta or advantage for Trump. So I can very much foresee a very, very messy election in 2028 with a lot of October surprises. And that is definitely something that we have to start taking stock of. In terms of the practice of the profession on polling, I definitely think that the future is multi-method, will be multi-method. I mean, right now in online polling, which is most of what we do at HarrisX, not exclusively, but let's say 70% of what we do, in some cases between front-end traps and back-end quality controls that we implement on anything from speeding, straight lining, bots behavior. In some cases, you're throwing away 50% of your sample already. Imagine in a world where AI gets more and more and more sophisticated, that obviously threat will increase, and I think that applies across different methods.
Okay, so Dritan's headline is Bots Ate the Election. Dave.
All right. So obviously predicting the future is super hard, especially 4 years
Got to
out.
do it.
Yes. So, I think that one of the reasons why it's so hard, I think that people really underestimate the amount of cultural change that has happened in the last 5 years. I think that there's probably been more change in the last 5 years than any other 5-year period since, probably the 60s. And you can just see that in a bunch of concrete ways. If you look at media usage, for example, the share of voters that got their news from TikTok quintupled from 2020 to 2024. It is now the dominant source of news for people under 40. The average 18 to 29-year-old spends 45 minutes a day on TikTok, and this is just a category that, again, did not exist, 4 years ago. And so, my point there isn't, to talk about TikTok. It's that, when people talk about AI, and my friends, they talk a lot about timelines. When you talk about economic dislocation, the answer is that nobody knows. But the cultural disruption from AI is already happening and will continue to happen. The world is going to keep changing, and it's going to keep changing faster, and it's going to get really weird. I think, now everyone is kind of acclimated to, social media, though I think, that's been really quite radical in terms of what that's done from an information perspective, and not even from a misinformation perspective, but just, highly educated elites used to dominate the news that regular people saw, and that just isn't true anymore. And the results of that have maybe been bad. It depends on your moral values. But I think just to give an example of how things will be weird, we've done polling on AI girlfriends, where we're like, oh, would you be interested in having an AI partner? And I'm serious. Obviously, for people over the age, for single people over the age of 35, something like 3 or 4% of people say yes. But when you look at 18-year-olds, something like 30% of 18-year-olds would say that they'd be interested in having a romantic partner. What happens when people talk to their AI partners about politics? That's like one random example. The world is just really going to get super, super weird. But, abstracting away from that, not talking about AI, I think the current moment to me, reminds me a lot of the 1980s, where in the 1980s, basically every single country in the West, there's like a couple of, South Korea is an exception, but but for the most part, lurched to the right. And, I think that it's like, why is something people can debate. You could argue it was inflation or stagflation or just, generationally, like the center-left parties around the world had really had this vote base of people who lived through the Great Depression and were radicalized by it. And in particular, they were dependent on this educational category of less than high school voters, which in 1950 was 80% of the electorate and now is like 5. And those people were just dying en masse while they were being replaced by this Alex P. Keaton generation of like super right-wing Gen X young people who are, still right-wing to this day. And I think that basically the entire socio-political cultural framework that the center left was built on no longer made sense. And in order to adapt, they had to make really, really hard changes. They had to decide that they wanted to listen, less to labor unions and more, and they had to care more about what economists had to say. They had to focus more on yuppies. And I think that there are just like a lot of parallels to that current moment. Like in the US, people who are under the age of 24 are very right wing. But that's happening, it's seemingly basically everywhere. It's happening in Canada, it's happening in Norway, it's happening in France and, Germany in kind of a weird way. We're seeing, and I think that we also have this situation very similar to the 1980s, where in the 1980s, the rise in social disorder and inflation basically discredited center-left ideas everywhere. And so, I think that we're kind of in a similar situation right now. And so the question is, country by country, you have different stories for how long it took, for the center left to make these really hard adjustments. And I really want to say they're really big. Like, go and read Michael Foot's platform in 1983 and compare it to how Tony Blair won. When he and so I think that's basically the question. Obviously, right now in the Democratic Party, nobody has the authority to say, oh, all of these interest groups and that we used to care an enormous amount about their opinions, we're not going to listen to them anymore. We're going to go listen to some totally different set of groups. No one has the authority to do that, because no one in the Democratic Party has any democratic legitimacy. That will all happen, in the Democratic primary, for better or for worse. Whoever wins the Democratic primary will reset the brand in the way that Donald Trump did in 2016. Like all of the 2012 to 2016 coalitional changes happened and I know because we were polling thousands of people a day at the time, happened basically on the day Trump became the nominee and not before. And so, I think that's, basically the headline is whoever wins the nomination either will represent this new coalitional framework in the same way, and do the equivalent of rejecting the Eleanor Roosevelt Democrats, or he won't. And then, obviously these are continuous things. It depends on the economy and whatever, but that will basically determine what happens.
Okay, so things got weird and we lurched to the right.
Yeah, there's a lot there. Jeez.
You're on,
I think it's important to wrap this whole thing. I don't want to speak for David, but I will, I guess, for right now, that we're in the business of winning elections and the mechanics of winning elections for campaigns and PACs and candidates and all that good stuff. So a lot of the things that we've heard today from speakers, a lot of quantitative research, a lot of news and public opinion. I've stopped trying to predict that far ahead because of what David said, how rapid change has become. And my focus has almost totally moved to culture and behavioral psychology because politics is downstream of culture now. And the way that we used to conduct data science experiments and research programs, even going back to 2012 in the Romney-Obama cycle, is vastly different today. The idea that you would ask your typical 8-issue questions on tax policy and immigration and healthcare is unrecognizable today. And the issues that really move voters today don't look like policy platforms anymore. We're also, what David and I work with is quantitative research for us is a response. It's like one data point, and I would say that we're working with, someone referenced it before, but massive amounts of data. Voter files, but what voter files are best? Consumer files, donation data. We're training on terabytes and terabytes of information to try to understand and predict elections. In terms of looking ahead, I won't go all the way to 28 right now because I think for Republicans, 26 is extremely important because you see two roads ahead of us here. It's, if Trump becomes a lame duck in 26, I have very serious questions if that means, this might sound extreme, but is it civil war in the Republican Party? Do the knives come out? Do the old faction, do the old guard come out that has been sitting in the shadows and, try to reclaim the party? Because right now the party is MAGA, it is Trump. The Republican Party itself, usually that happens with the sitting president, but if we go that path, I think it's going to be a very contentious primary. I think will look something like a la 2016. And I think I worked for 3 Republicans before I got to Trump in that primary, which, will be very interesting. But if it's not, and Republicans are successful in 26, does that mean JD's presumptive? I don't know. I've been telling people until recently, I don't think we're talking about who the nominee will be yet in the 2028 Republican primary. I think what it takes to win elections in this country, again, goes far more back to culture now than it has before. Starting with name ID is really important. It's the most expensive thing to buy in politics, is how well known you are. But again, going back to what David said, the last 5 years have been insane in terms of technological progress, and I can't predict what the next 3 years will look like, but we just have to be ready for it, which is why the stuff that we did in 2024 probably won't be relevant to 2026 and 2028.
Okay, so some sort of culture war potentially on the right, fight for the heart of the Republican Party, depending on what happened in the 2026 election. All right, so you've kind of laid some stakes in the ground, different kinds of explanations you'd look for. I want you to now think about, since we've got time to think about this, what study would you design in advance of that election? Because you have to do a study design in advance of an election, right? What's your methodology? How would you know? Most postmortems on elections that are in the public domain are just people making up shit off the top of their head. And it's like, I got to get an op-ed out. Here's some poll data, caught my attention. But inside the parties, inside the firms, it's a lot more thoughtful. People are really working hard to figure out what is happening inside the Republican Party and so forth. So what's the study you would do to go after the claim you have made about it being a culture war? Let's start and go in reverse order.
There's 2 things we're looking at right now. One is a bit more old school that we started in 2016, and one's a bit more progressive. So first I'll start with inference sampling. So there was talk on the last panel about deception in polling, shy Trump voters. That was something we fortunately picked up on very early. And there's a lot of techniques of the idea of inference sampling used in foreign elections. The idea that we are not going to ask you to inform on yourself, but we're going to ask you to inform on your community or your friends or your family. So instead, we noticed, and I have the data on this to prove it, deception in polling was a very real thing in 2016 and a big lever, several percentage points. And instead of asking, and we noticed that most on live callers, because people were more embarrassed to admit to a person they were going to vote for Trump on the phone with a live caller. So we started asking, instead of, are you planning to vote for President Trump in the 2016 election, are your friends, your family, your community? So we've been exploring a lot of interesting techniques around inference sampling. But then second, we're moving heavily into social listening. I think a lot of people have brought up the difficulties with traditional polling or quantitative research. Again, for us, it's a response. David and I think I collected close to 1 million sample in 2020, an insane amount of polling that's done. What Robert said was on the nose. Short questionnaires, massively high sample read, because I'm using it to train models, ultimately. So I have become very dubious of online panels. To the point of fraud, on how accurate the data responses you're getting back from them. Live calls are expensive. Maybe AI changes this, I don't know. But we're currently looking at, AI has opened things in a way for us to do very intelligent scraping and listening to social media, comments on most of the platforms that are out there that exist, and how do you use that and tune that in combination with quantitative research to get a better direction. And what we found so far is elements of social listening run in front of quantitative research, so we can kind of predict where quant will be about a week ahead of time and then re-verify with quantitative research. So when I'm looking at and designing studies, I would say progressively we're looking at more social listening, and I would say retroactively we're doing a lot of fun stuff with inference sampling.
Cool. David.
Yeah, I mean, I have one quibble with what you just said on inference sampling, which is, so obviously there's like lots of stories of people going, oh, well, I switched to asking how your neighbors will vote, and then I got more accurate results, and that means that the people were being shy Trump voters. But no, that you wouldn't expect that at all. I think for me, when you think of polling error, the 3 people give different explanations. Oh, the undecideds broke late, or oh, we got the turnout sample wrong, or shy Trump voters. In almost every single election that, and at this point I've worked in, I don't know, like hundreds of them, it's always non-response bias, and I'm going to just talk more about that in the methods section, where basically people who answer surveys are really weird and increasingly weird. When I started in my working in this industry, we had a 12% response rate, and I think now phone response rates, if you measure them correctly, are closer to like 0.3 or 0.4%. And so at that point, if 1 in 200 people are answering a survey becomes a political act. And this is just like a really existential issue for polling, because the two biggest predictors for answering a phone survey are, one, how much you care about politics, and two, your latent socioeconomic status. Higher SES people answer surveys more. And 10 years ago, one, response rates were a lot higher, but two, both of those things were pretty uncorrelated with who you voted for. Now, the two biggest predictors of who you're voting for are, one, socioeconomic status, and two, how much you care about politics. Now, even if you control for race and education and income and all these other things, people who vote in midterms are something like 20% more Democratic than people who don't vote in presidentials. And to me, that's why I think it's totally insane that anyone does phone polling at this point. It's like honestly malpractice. Like obviously people online, there's fraud, there's bots, but like the reality is that, if you look at a sample of people who, like my favorite stat on this is if you do a phone poll and you ask someone how likely are they to vote, the people who say they're definitely going to vote have like a 97% chance of voting, and the people who say they definitely won't vote still have like an 80% chance of voting, because it's just, you have to be a crazy person to answer a phone survey. And given that we now know that latent political engagement is super correlated with who you're voting for, controlling for other stuff, that was not true 4 years ago, but now it is. It's just insane. There's like, the only way you could make that make sense is if you're just like really making a bunch of arbitrary decisions on the other way, in the other direction, to keep the Democratic number down. And so I think it's like a big problem with the industry, where it's like we've known that these methods are fundamentally broken for a long time, but in order to fix them, you have to build these giant first-party data sets like voter files, and you have to hire a bunch of data scientists, and you just have to do a bunch of stuff that like the people who work at these firms don't know how to do, and so I think people just kind of throw their hands up and ignore it, and it's not good. But on the inference sampling point, I think what's really going on there, and Andrew Gelman has some great blog posts about this, is that the person who picks up your survey is super weird, but it turns out his neighbors are way less weird. And so if you ask him about it, like you could imagine, like you call into, you're calling into rural Mississippi, and the only person who picks up is like the one weird liberal Democrat who like lives out there, and because they're really mad about something. And then you go and they pick up and you go, oh, what about your neighbors? And then they accurately tell you, oh yeah, my neighbors are way more Republican than me. And so that's the actual kind of idea behind this like inference sampling thing, is it's a really clever way to get around like non-response bias if you can weight it in the right way. But on the methods piece, I think, because of this non-response bias issue that we talked about before, you really need to be controlling for way more stuff than you have in the past. Like pollsters right now control for like, age and race and gender and, after 2016 education, sometimes party registration. But the reality is that surveys work if the people who you survey are statistically exchangeable with the people who don't answer your survey after you control what you control for with respect to what you're trying to model. And, the two ways you can get around that are, one, you could try to get more normal people to take your surveys. That's impossible. Anyone who claims that they can do that, there's just too many demands. There are now multi-trillion dollar corporations competing with each other over getting people's attention. There's like no way you're going to win that fight. Or you can start to control for way more stuff. But if you control for way more stuff, traditional weighting techniques don't work because of the curse of dimensionality. And then you just have to, one, getting all that new information is hard. But like, I don't know. I just think like the nature of what you have to do to live in this world is like so different from, oh, I'm gonna, get a poli-sci grad student and we're gonna like craft this like 12 question instrument and survey a couple thousand people. Like the way that I think, I don't know the Republican side very well, but I suspect the way that both parties operate internally is just, much, much more sophisticated and much more complicated than that, in a way that's like hard to summarize.
Dritan, what's the study you do in advance of the 2028 election to tell your story of your postmortem?
Sure. Well, my old mentor when I was an undergrad here, Sam Huntington, used to say that there's many truths. The difficulty is finding the truth that is most relevant. And so my perspective is that the more complex the world becomes, the more valuable simple traditional tools will become to cut through all of the noise. And I actually think that it's a very exciting time to be a pollster, to be a data scientist, to be an analyst, because my prediction for 2028 is that you're going to be running not only online polling and phone polling, but you're probably going to want to do in-person polling as well. And actually that is becoming more and more accessible rather than less accessible. And it's becoming cheaper rather than more expensive, as the trend has been. You're going to want to have panels. For example, in our polling, and we've had 2 waves of presidential elections where we've been very, very accurate with our polling, but still the factor, as Sam, wherever he's sitting, the factor that, you know, the online polling keeps missing and you need to account for is non-response bias by, you know, non-college white men, right? That is where we constantly fall the farthest off the mark. For that, you're probably going to want to be doing some panels. You're probably going to be doing some in-person polling. And then you take all of that together, you merge it with the power of AI, and that will essentially help you understand that last 10% or 20% of voters that are undecided all the way until the end. Because 80% of voters, they make up their mind 3 months or before which way they're going to go. And in some cases, even a year before, based on a series of factors like, you know, where they stand on their personal finances, where they stand with satisfaction and the job approval metrics on various areas. In hindsight, you see that these variables, if we had looked at the atmospherics in the polling, despite how close the polling was in 2024, there's really no way that Kamala Harris could have won, right? If you look at that, the dissatisfaction, the fact that almost half of the respondents said that they were their personal finances were becoming worse off, and that group was consistently saying that they were looking for a change, then there's no surprise that Donald Trump won 82% of that group. And those who said that they were the same and they were essentially treading water, he actually underperformed with that group, but he still won over a third of that group. And so I think the future is very U-shaped. On one side, you will rely a lot on traditional methods, on the questions that have high predictive value over and over. And then on the other side, you will mix survey-based data, stated data with behavioral data, as the other panelists are saying, and the power of AI, which really can build dynamic profiles that are anchored in surveys, that the RAG model, to prevent hallucination, let's say it's 50% anchored in the first party research or in the primary research, and 50% is everything that you're scraping in the web. And you can see the resistance of these specific segments vis-a-vis new messages, vis-a-vis new events, and track them in real time and see how much they're shifting. So that's kind of my view about 2028. You're going to want to be across many different methods and blend it all together.
Great. Let's take some questions and keep the questions super short and the answers super short.
So I want to ask you guys about the 2028 Democratic primary. So David Axelrod often says, and I think it's a really good point, that parties are often correcting both for the last president, but also the last presidential candidate that lost. So how do you think Democratic primary voters might be thinking about 2024 and how they want to do things differently?
Sure. And, I want to say something about primaries, which is that primaries are chaotic in the literal mathematical sense, because there's tons of, tons of people who run per faction, and then whoever wins Iowa gets a big boost, high sensitivity to initial conditions, classically impossible thing to predict. But I'd say probably the big one, I personally hate this because I think it's empirically wrong, but I've heard, you hear very, very commonly people saying, oh, we need a white man, which really annoys me because, I think the econometric literature suggests that female and non-white Democratic candidates don't face a penalty. Female candidates do better, somewhat because they have fewer sex scandals. But so I think that's the biggest one I've heard. But then beyond that, I think you have a very interesting situation where both the left and right wings of the party have a pretty coherent and actually subtly quite similar critique of the Kamala Harris campaign, that it wasn't focused enough on economic issues, that it wasn't populist enough. And so, obviously they'll produce two different candidates. But I think that's probably going to be the main reaction, is this kind of rejection of, the current liberal status quo one way or the other.
Other question. Haley.
So a lot of polling and what you talk about has to do with, thank you. A lot of polling research and what you talk about has to do with what the candidate should talk about. But to your earlier point about TikTok and how media consumption has changed so much, how are you thinking about better understanding how to talk to voters and that dynamic in the next election?
Matt.
2024, if you think about elections and waves of innovation, to me, 24 was the influencer election. 2016, we probably sound old now, but that was the Facebook election. Know it very well. And then...
what was the MySpace election?
Oh, gosh. Yeah, exactly. So media and media consumption is so decentralized now. Where people get information from went from a few main power sources to thousands, maybe even hundreds of thousands at that point. So that makes it a big challenge for us, because a lot of what we do, on top of targeting, it's also media preference and media planning. So what's the right message through the right vehicle to send to the right person? And that becomes very difficult if a young conservative is listening to Theo Vaughn and Joe Rogan and platforms that you can't just send a programmatic ad to very quickly, right? I think campaigns are starting to think, I think you're seeing a reversion from micro-targeting, and I've kind of wondered if this was going to happen, where I wonder if our industry over-focused on the individual and less on communities and tribes, and that's a lot of the work that I'm doing now, is trying to understand both political and consumer micro-tribes, because the way that media is consumed today makes it very difficult for guys like us to actually reach that and understand that to the individual. I don't know if you would add that.
Charlotte, you had your hand up too, and we'll let Dritan take this one.
With the rise of online polling and multimodal research, do you think there's any difference left between polling, data collection, and forecasting?
Yeah, that's a great question. They serve very different purposes, in my opinion, right? Polling tends to be very anchored, and as the previous panel spoke about, right, despite the challenges, you can get both a good mix of random opinions and randomization and representativeness. My view is that in the world of AI that is going to be able to model across multiple data sets, create the census level files, do the scraping, the polling becomes the key file, the key component to anchor everything. Because, and we are working at HarrisX a lot with artificial intelligence and rolling out our own AI tools in the next few months. What I notice is that if you don't anchor your RAG model at least 50% on the polling, it starts hallucinating in crazy, crazy ways. Right, and in ways that can be very misleading, because the information and the data is all within the same environment or within the same theme. So it's plausible enough that it's very difficult to make the different distinctions. So again, I think that we're going to be relying on a lot of different methods at a lot of different stages, and all together is what really will make the special sauce and the special formula. Otherwise, a lot of what you see with high velocity within social media, I mean, that can be a lot of noise. Like it's very difficult to make sense of it and to anchor it unless you really have some of these traditional methods within the mix.
Great. Let's take some questions over here. Rachel.
So we know that young people are traditionally hard to poll because they're not very likely to answer the phone, and you've mentioned some concerns with online polling. So I'm curious, we know that young people are going to be more of a focus in 2028 than they have been previously. Where do you guys see the biggest innovations happening in terms of polling young people, and how are you approaching that ahead of 2028?
Yeah, I mean, I just want to highlight, I think one of my, I guess, fringe, positions is, we polled, I'd say we did about 30 million interviews last year, and our estimates of the youth vote are much more conservative than everyone else's. And our basic thesis for why is that among young people, actually more so than anyone else, there is this super strong correlation between political engagement and how liberal you are. And so, we think, for example, that Donald Trump won 18 to 29-year-olds, while I think the exit poll estimate is that Harris won them by 10. And so, this gets to the non-response thing I was talking about earlier, where I think people really underestimate the extent to which current methods really mess up subgroups dramatically. My example of this is in 2020, Nationscape, they did, which is well regarded and everything, and I have no qualms with them, but they surveyed, I think, thousands of Hispanics in Florida and predicted that Biden was going to do about, I think, 13% better with Hispanics in Florida. And when you actually do the ecological regression, it's clear that actually we did like 14% worse. And I think with young people, there's a pretty similar situation. Like if you do not take non-response bias extremely seriously, I think that you will get the youth vote wrong just because they're much less likely to answer surveys. I think honestly, Zachary somewhere in the audience has done some good work on this. We have to start relying more on old school political science stuff like ecological regression. We have to look more at party registration data. Like if you actually look at the shape of two-way party registration by age, it's like pretty clear that the exit poll estimates on this are totally wrong. But it just highlights, I think everyone wants to be like, oh, we're just going to do this survey and do all the right things and get the right answer. And I don't think we're in that world anymore.
Could I add one thing to that? Or?
No, we're going to do one-on-one. So, Mark, you're on Matt.
Sure. Well, I'm going to do the counterweight to the question of young people. Young people turnout was 47%. Old people turnout was 75%. We have more nonagenarians than ever in history. We have more people in their 70s and 80s. Are you worried about that? And as you notice, the average age of people getting elected to president has gotten a little older. So maybe it's the older vote that needs a little more focus in polling, and are there anything special you're doing for that older vote?
Matt?
Yeah, I think this is probably where it's a little bit different by party. I think people were talking before, like, we don't really do much IVR work anymore, but you could argue to that 70-plus audience, there is still merit for Republicans in using that to reach some of those audiences. Without a doubt, it's the largest, most mobilized voting bloc, and it's only getting bigger and more active from a lot of ways. So I'm concerned in general. The last question, your question, I'm concerned with how we get quality data from anybody moving forward. I think if somebody can solve that problem, they're going to make billions of dollars doing it. I don't know if that's going back to more qual and in-person interviews. Something else David was saying before, like with panels, you also have to watch out like how panels are incentivized, because sometimes, depending on the pollster you're working with, people are getting paid to take, and you have to account for that bias. Most work we do today with research is like an insane amount of waiting for bias that is in survey work, and to the point where it's like, well, is this even worth it anymore? I'm so far removed from what this thing originally was at this point. But yes, like definitely an audience that we have to pay attention to, and Republicans should be concerned specifically as aging college-educated women. We hear that all the time, but that is a huge issue for us right now.
Interesting. Question from one of the students. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm really curious. You've mentioned both sort of the flaws. Thank you. You mentioned the flaws with both sort of phone polls and online opt-in panel polls during the course of this panel. So I'm curious, what exactly is the way forward? I know, David, you mentioned that you've done tons of interviews over the course of 2024 and have some ways of doing that. But is it possible still, within the context of a poll, to do so at a scale that is not, like RNC, DNC, to actually run a good sample for these?
I mean, it just depends on your desired level of accuracy. But I just think, polling involves so many tiny decisions that, even avid consumers of polls online don't know anything about. Like, they're always like, oh, cell phones, IVR, but actually, there's tons of like record linkage rule decisions that end up influencing poll results by a lot. And so I think there isn't really any way to, I do think there's polls work unreasonably well when you, at the end of the day, polls usually aren't off by more than 2 or 3%. And if you're okay with that, that's good. But I think that in order to really make these decisions coherently, you need to think about it more like in finance. You need to actually do back testing. You need to work in a large volume of races and try doing things a bunch of different ways to try to accumulate rules. And then what sucks is, even if something worked last time, the world can change under you, the response patterns can change, the coalitions can change. But I think that it's such a complex problem with so many knobs that you really have to think about it systematically and empirically rather than just try to reason about it from first principles or read papers. Is my take.
Sorry, Steve, I'm going to jump in this because it's an important question. Look, polling is not just about validating or trying to guess the outcome. It's about persuading, it's about experimentation, right? In politics, we like to joke and we say that a lot of the message testing polling is biased by design, because you try to push audiences as far as you can in one direction, and then you try to bring them back with the positive messaging, and then you do that in reverse, and you really see the resistance level. The reason for that is what really I learned from Mark the first day that I started working with him, which is voters are cross-pressured. And especially younger voters, right, which are spending way too much time on social media. They need to be reading more because they're not tethered in anything. They're very easy to mobilize, but their opinions are more fungible than clay. So it's one of those things where you really have to engage in as much experimentation as you can across as many methods in order to really see where the center lies and how much resistance there is to moving one way or another on different issues.
Matt, you clearly want to make the last comment, and it is to you.
And it depends what your purpose is. Are you trying to educate the public? Are you trying to come up with prescriptive intelligence to allocate hundreds of millions of dollars for a presidential campaign? Those are two very different things. Ultimately, I don't really care. If I knew the outcome of the election, why even do the campaign, right? Why even work in it? So ultimately, I think to what you just said, it's what are the levers we can pull to motivate and mobilize people? And I think there's certainly a place for that in research. I mean, people have been decrying the death of research and I don't want to come across as doing that, but I think things are just changing. It's going to be a part of what we do. It's ultimately what's your purpose in using it for.
Great. I want to thank Dritan, David, and Matt. And thanks to all of you, and excellent questions.